B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Tuesday, August 27th, 2019. Bernie Sanders has unveiled a detailed plan for media reform in this country. I fully support it, and it's long overdue. Now, it's very interesting because as one of the top 3 polling Democratic presidential candidates, unveiling a major media reform plan should draw the attention of major media outlets, the corporate ones like the New York Times and the Washington Post. And I haven't had a chance to survey television since this was released, but I will note that Bernie Sanders had to publish his media manifesto in a British newspaper. The Guardian published it today, along with a curious kind of counterpoint that we'll get to in a moment. But Senator Sanders invokes Walter Cronkite and Joseph Pulitzer to talk about what the media should be. And he notes that it has descended into clickbait, tabloid bullshit. In way too many respects. Now, those are mostly my words. But he also notes that the funding for media, the revenue streams, have been grabbed by tech companies in Silicon Valley. Facebook and Google control 60% of the entire digital advertising market. They have used monopolistic control to siphon off advertising revenues from news organizations, and he cites a recent study by the News Media Alliance that in 2018, as newspaper revenues declined, Google made almost $5 billion off of news reporting that Google did not pay for. He says at the same time, corporate conglomerates and hedge fund vultures have bought and consolidated local newspapers, slashed their newsrooms. He deplores the decimation of journalism. Over the past 15 years, more than 1,400 communities have lost newspapers, the outlets that local TV, radio, and digital news sites rely on for reporting. Since 2008, we've seen newsrooms cut 28,000 employees, and in the past year, 3,200 in the media have been laid off. And he acknowledges some good reporting, the Miami Herald expose on Jeffrey Epstein, the Charleston newspapers reporting on the opioid crisis. And he specifically separates himself from Donald Trump attacking the media as fake news and the enemy of the people. Quote, Trump's authoritarian bullying of the media is totally unacceptable. It must be denounced and rejected. But that alone will not solve the journalism crisis. He said TV networks rely on $4.5 billion a year of pharmaceutical ads, and they may be thrilled to sugarcoat our current dysfunctional health care system, but they'll never provide a consistently fair hearing for something like Medicare for All, even though polls show that a majority of Americans support it. Corporate media organizations sponsored by fossil fuel ads may gladly provide a platform for guests who insist that our current oligarchic economy is just great. But the same outlets often downplay or omit coverage of the climate crisis that those advertisers help create. And he goes after Disney and Bezos, saying that they may happily tout Disney films and Bezos' plans for space exploration, but we can't count on them to consistently and aggressively cover workers' fight for better wages at Disney or Bezos-controlled companies. In fact, in one instance, we saw the Washington Post, which Bezos owns, try to punish a reporter because he spoke out for better wages at the paper. So this is not just a complaint. He's got plans to try to turn it around. He said that his administration would not rubber stamp proposals like the new plan to merge CBS back into Viacom. He says, I've long opposed media consolidation, was one of only 16 members of the House to oppose Bill Clinton, he doesn't name him, his disastrous 1996 Telecommunications Act. He said under existing federal laws, we'll start requiring major media corporations to disclose whether or not their corporate transactions and merger proposals will involve significant journalism layoffs. We will require before any future mergers can take place, employees must be given the opportunity to purchase media outlets through employee stock ownership plans. I like that. We will prevent media-related merger and deregulation decisions at federal agencies that adversely affect people of color and women. In a Bernie Sanders administration, we will reinstate and strengthen media ownership rules, limit the number of stations that large broadcasting corporations can own in each market and nationwide. We will pass my workplace democracy plan, which will boost media workers' efforts to form unions and collectively bargain with their employers. And when it comes to Silicon Valley, Sanders says he'll appoint an attorney general and a federal trade commission who will more stringently enforce antitrust laws, and he names Facebook and Google. I think this is an excellent plan. I await the embrace of it by the New York Times, the Washington Post, and pick your favorite television news outlet. Chances are you won't see or hear anything about it in those outlets. I did see that Common Dreams, the independent news and commentary site, has posted Bernie's media plan today. That is the only place I saw it in my daily survey of news outlets. So, as I mentioned, I give The Guardian credit for publishing Bernie's media reform plan. And maybe they felt out of some sense of fairness they should provide a counterpoint. And so Joan E. Grieve, based in Washington, D.C., don't know who she is. Since there's no other attribution, she may be a staff writer for The Guardian. But she uses the old Fox News trick of citing some people and some observers. Let me quote. The Vermont senator's campaign has repeatedly questioned the alleged biases of the mainstream media in recent days, leading some to compare Sanders to the president he hopes to defeat. Now, just who? Because I haven't heard that from anyone, except reading this column by Joan E. Grieve. But she persists. While media-based complaints are nothing new for Sanders, they come amid an increasing willingness among broader Democratic presidential field to harshly criticize the press, even as violence against U.S. journalists has escalated and the president's hostile rhetoric of fake news continues unabated. Here she goes again. To some observers, again, who? It now seems the anti-media accusations of the right are being mirrored on the left, albeit not at the dangerous levels of the president. Well, this is bullshit. This is a false equivalence, and that's why I pointed out when I scanned through and quoted parts of Sanders' manifesto that he explicitly separates himself from the anti-media rhetoric of Trump. And to claim that Sanders' criticism of the failures of media to cover important topics somehow puts individual reporters at risk for their safety, that is insulting. And there is no mention here of the failures of the media in the Russiagate scandal and how that makes them vulnerable to the fake news attacks that come from Trump. So you can read her piece if you wish, but I found it pretty silly, frankly. Now, the same Guardian, based in Britain, is the only place I found this story today. James Biden, the brother of the Democratic presidential frontrunner, Joe Biden, is facing renewed claims that James Biden lured potential business associates with promises that his brother could be influenced to help them make more money. Now, there are sworn declarations coming from two different potential partners that Biden was talking about, Jim Biden was. And in both cases, he told them that his brother would help their companies land lucrative contracts with the government. Now, I didn't even know about James Biden. I've heard about Hunter, Joe Biden's son, who got the cushy board seat at the Ukrainian energy company after Joe had meddled in internal Ukrainian politics. But these charges are in sworn statements in a court. Two different companies, Azam and Diverse Medical, sued James Biden back in June, claiming he had used his influence in a scheme to bankrupt their model of medical care offered to rural residents in treating opioid addiction, mental health issues, veterans issues, and sexual trauma. Now, obviously, I don't know all the details of the back and forth between James Biden and these companies. But the CEO of one company, Michael Fry, testified that during a presentation in January of 2018, James Biden interrupted me to say, "My brother needs to have you in every court system in America." In another declaration, James Biden was quoted as promising that the DMM psychiatric care model would be used by Joe Biden as part of his campaign. In a phone call to an executive, quote, James Biden mentioned that his brother's connections to labor unions and the Department of Veterans Affairs would help the company expand its model nationwide. Now, this pales in comparison to the open profiteering of Trump, the Trump family, the Trump business. I mean, there was Trump in France yesterday staging an infomercial for his Doral resort in Miami, the perfect location for the next G7 or G8 summit. And so in some ways, we're a little jaded by the bad example set by Trump. But this is another example of the kind of cronyism that afflicts both political parties, and it is part of now the baggage of candidate Joe Biden. Candidate Tom Steyer, he is the San Francisco-based billionaire. He ran a hedge fund. He worked for Goldman Sachs. And then he has told us he left the evil side behind to devote his fortune to philanthropy and political action. He's the guy who funded millions of dollars of pro-impeachment ads. He has now dropped $12 million in Iowa in the last 6 weeks. He doesn't need your money to campaign, but because of the standards of the Democratic National Committee about who gets invited to the presidential debates, he is spending money early to try to jack up his poll numbers so he gets invited to the debate stage. And I have to say that I don't mind that a billionaire wants to burn his money for a good cause, but I'm wary of anybody buying an election and simply establishing stature or status because of the money in his stock portfolio. At the same time, his call to action over climate change is something that I fully embrace. And so I have very mixed feelings. We have no idea what Jim Steyer's foreign policy would be, what his approach to working families and the middle class would be. But he postures as an outsider. He said, everybody else in this race, including Warren and Biden, comes from D.C. They're part of the establishment. So if you think the problem is broken government, which is what I think, if you think that corporations have bought the government, who do you think is going to reform it? Do you think it's going to be someone from the grassroots, from the outside, who's done it for 10 years? Or do you think it's coming from someone from D.C.? Well, that insider-outsider play is really one of the oldest saws in American electoral politics. And I believe it's pretty meaningless these days. Yesterday, I quoted somewhat liberally from Ken Freeland's critical analysis of Democratic presidential candidates' foreign policy positions that was published at Mint Press. And it drew a quick and angry response from John Zwiebel, our friend and supporter in Hawaii. He says Ken Freeland is full of shit. He recycles the same anti-Tulsi propaganda that was originally on tulsigabbard.guru, a website that was taken down several months ago, having accomplished its job of providing just enough doubt about Gabbard that shills like Freeland will repeat it without question. And Zwiebel says, yes, she's a supporter of Israel, just like all the others, and he was very offended that she voted for House Resolution 246, which denounced the BDS movement aimed at Israel. And I respect his support for Tulsi Gabbard. But I think we have to listen to all views, and we especially need to listen to sharp criticism and then make our own decisions. And that's what I'll continue to do here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast. Every day I pause for a second to thank the people who support my work, and John Zwiebel kicks in $10 every month. I do appreciate his support, even when we don't see eye to eye on every item. And I also want to thank Jerry Frazia. He's a staunch supporter with an annual subscription who listens offshore in the beautiful northern part of Italy. And I want to thank Doug Cooper, who just took out a new subscription here to the PBC podcast, along with David Radcliffe. And who else do I have here on my list? Elizabeth Vasquez. I'm grateful to each and every one of you. I invite others to join in. We have subscribers who cancel occasionally, and we have new people who join up. I'd like you to join the roster and support the efforts that I provide you on a daily basis here. Visit peterbcollins.com, click menu, click Become a Subscriber. You land on that sign-up page, and you can take care of business right there. So I've linked to this amusing recitation of Donald Trump's 68-minute press conference in Biarritz, France yesterday. I mentioned that much of it was promotional blather about the magnificent bungalows at his Doral resort near Miami. And he went into detail. We got plenty of parking. Each country can have its own building and blah, blah, blah. Largest ballroom in Florida. Did you know that? And while so much of this is trivial and has become commonplace for this guy, number 45, it is amazing to try to figure out how that mind of his works. So one of the things that the Washington Post takes him to task for is actually something that I have to begrudgingly admit is true. Related to Ukraine, which was the event, the annexation of Crimea, that led to the expulsion of Russia from the G8. Trump said President Putin outsmarted President Obama, calling it very embarrassing for Obama. And I think that's true. The U.S. had pledged to defend Ukraine when it disarmed its nuclear weapons under the Bill Clinton administration. And we conveniently forgot about that when Russia moved on Crimea. Now, I don't, backseat drive this for Obama. I don't think he had a choice. He wasn't going to launch a war with Russia over Ukraine and Crimea. But I think it is fair to say that Putin grabbed Crimea knowing that the U.S. and NATO would make a lot of noise, but not really do much about it. And I believe that that is a done deal, a done deed, and that the continuing effort to isolate Russia is generally counterproductive. And then there was this exchange regarding Crimea with Yamiche Alcindor, the African-American reporter for PBS News. And to her credit, she challenged him and said, "Why do you keep using a lie?" Which, that is the consensus view. It's not mine. Why do you keep using a lie about, why Russia was expelled from the G8? And he condescendingly responded to her that the implication is, because she's black, "I know you like President Obama." And the Washington Post notes that he said that without saying how he knew that. "I'm not blaming him." Referring to Obama, he said, before blaming him extensively because, quote, "a lot of bad things happened." And, of course, over the 4-day period at the end of last week, he called China's president an enemy, admitted second thoughts on the escalating trade deal, reversed course hours later, and then vowed that a deal would be coming soon. And when asked, aren't you making the problem worse? Aren't you making the prospect of a deal harder? He said, sorry, it's how I negotiate. It's been very successful over the years. And then he was pressed on these alleged high-level calls coming from China begging to get back to the negotiating table. Chinese government officials said they were unaware of any such calls. And so then Mnuchin, he is a Munchkin, he had to kind of correct his statement, saying, well, there had been communications. But it appears that Trump made that up, along with the notion that his beautiful wife, model wife, trophy wife, had met Kim Jong-un, when, in fact, she has not. Also, in cleanup following the G7 summit in Biarritz, Iran, through its president, Hassan Rouhani, has said, well, yeah, I am willing to meet with Trump, but first, he's going to have to make some concessions. And without the U.S. withdrawal from sanctions, we will not witness any positive development. So I think that the dream of that rapprochement that I mentioned yesterday may be just a notion at this point. So the other fallout from the G7 summit relates to my reference to trophy wives. So Trump has a wife who's more than 20 years younger than him. Jair Bolsonaro, the idiot who now runs Brazil, he's got a wife who I think is 27 years younger than him. And Emmanuel Macron, the youthful president of France, has a much older wife. She's 20-plus years older than him. So Bolsonaro, in a, kind of proxy for who's got the biggest junk, he made a tweet where he took a swipe at the looks of Mrs. Macron. But when Macron basically just tried to diplomatically say, isn't it sad that he's attacking my wife? Well, Bolsonaro took that as an insult to his person. And so now, as the fire burns out of control, it's fires in the Amazon, Bolsonaro is saying that, well, to talk or accept anything from France, even with their very best intentions, he will have to withdraw his words and then we can talk. First he withdraws them, then he makes the offer, then I'll answer. So, petty squabbles over trophy wives are delaying a response to a serious threat to the ecology of the planet. And that's what we'll remember 50 years from now, as the planet's on fire, the sea levels have risen, and any action by humans was delayed so that we could work out these very important differences between world leaders. And Bolsonaro thanked Trump after the Donald expressed support for the Brazilian president through a tweet. Doesn't that make you feel better? Credit to Ryan Grimm at The Intercept for exposing and detailing the role that top Trump crony, I knew I could say that, Steve Schwartzman has in relation to the burning of the Amazon. Schwartzman, who has control of Blackstone, a private equity fund, through various entities, controls Hydrovius, which is a company which is ripping out trees to build a road to access ports so that they can grow crops, food crops, in the Amazon and essentially transfer them along the BR 163 highway to the port city, which I can't quite identify for you on this map here. At any rate, I've linked to the story, and you can read it. I think it's pretty interesting, and it shows that profiteers who are very central to Trump's inner circle. Schwartzman once promised to privatize the military occupation of Afghanistan, just because he loves the United States so much. And one more story on the climate. They're downplaying sea level rise as the driving issue. but Jakarta on the island of Java is currently the capital of Indonesia. And for the past 3 years, the sea level has been rising by 3 inches per year. And back in 2017, they had a lot of storm action that produced freak floods. And so now they've decided to build a new capital on the island of Borneo, which doesn't have a history of quakes, tsunamis, or volcanic eruptions. And so this is the first, I think, major move to address sea level rise caused by climate change by a substantial country. Israel, in my view, is operating the way Netanyahu did a few years ago when he was facing re-election. You remember 3 teenage boys were kidnapped, and Netanyahu knew they were dead. But they ran a search and destroy mission, rummaging through Palestinian villages, and it was all a show to try to burnish his re-election chances. And as you know, he's facing a rerun of the election this spring because he was unable to form a government. And once again, the death of a 17-year-old Israeli girl last week, killed in an explosion. Israel says the blast was a Palestinian attack. We don't have strong evidence of that, but let's assume it's true. It's time for a disproportionate response and more collective punishment. So, airstrikes over the Gaza Strip followed an order by Netanyahu to cut the fuel to the power plants in Gaza, which reduces the amount of electrical service on a daily basis. And then, regrettably, from my point of view, 3 rockets were launched from Gaza into southern Israel, and of course that led to an even greater retaliation. It's always disproportional, and it sends the clear message that an Israeli life is worth more than any number of Palestinian lives. Back here in the United States, patience is running thin in the Farm Belt for Trump's trade war with China. And despite the fact that Trump has diverted $28 billion in agricultural commodity credits, it's a form of socialism. It's welfare for agribusiness. And despite that $28 billion, the loss of roughly $24 billion in exports is really putting a hurt on farm states. China has indicated that it will import 0 American farm products as long as the trade war continues. A federal judge in Missouri, at the last minute, has issued an order blocking the activation of a new law that bans abortion after 8 weeks. Federal District Judge Howard Sachs correctly identified that the legislation seems designed as a protest against Supreme Court decisions. The hostility to and refusal to comply with the Supreme Court's abortion jurisprudence is most obviously demonstrated in the attempt to push viability protection downward in various weekly stages to 8 weeks. The Missouri law also includes a clause that if the U.S. Supreme Court overturns the landmark 1973 Roe v. Wade decision, that a statewide abortion ban would automatically take place. So their unconstitutional motives there are very clear, and I'm glad to note that the judge agrees with me. Meanwhile, in Oklahoma, a judge reached the right decision, but was really light on the fine against Johnson & Johnson, the pharmaceutical and consumer products company that has been fingered as a major cause of the addiction and death from opioids in Oklahoma. In a 42-page decision, Judge Thad Balkman ruled the company bore a wide responsibility for helping create the worst drug epidemic in U.S. history, that Johnson & Johnson not only aggressively pushed false claims about the safety and effectiveness of its narcotic painkillers, but that it changed medical practice with deceptive claims intended to break down caution among doctors. but he ordered the company to pay a paltry $572 million. The prosecutors had asked for $17 billion. Now, the Purdue Pharma Company, the OxyContin makers, they decided not to go to trial, and they settled for $270 million. But this story is not over. Both plaintiffs will be playing a central role in the consolidated case that is being conducted in Cleveland, and I expect substantial fines will be issued at that point. And we wrap up today with a couple of Jeffrey Epstein stories. The man who allegedly committed suicide in a highly secured federal jail in Manhattan did not face his accusers today, but they came to court as the judge is trying to ease the pain of the inevitable. Because Epstein is reported to be dead, the government has no choice but to dismiss the charges against him. And his victims were given voice. Some spoke to the judge, some provided written statements, and some were represented by their attorneys. And so I give the judge credit. Under the law, he has no latitude. The case must be dismissed. But will his co-conspirators be held to account? That remains to be seen. And I give credit to Peter Aldhouse, a reporter at BuzzFeed News, for a deep dive into Jeffrey Epstein's philanthropy aimed at scientists at prominent universities. This runs almost 40 pages, and they name names of the Harvard math biologist Martin Nowak, celebrity physicist Lawrence Krauss, and many others, including Leon Black and his family foundation, who in some ways collaborated with Epstein in his donations to science programs. And what's critical is that some people, after Epstein was convicted and given the sweetheart sentence in Florida for pedophilia, they stopped dealing with Epstein. Others kept taking the money. Others kept taking the money, presumably while holding their noses. Thanks for joining me for my News and Comment podcast. Let's do that again. Thanks for listening to this News and Comment podcast all the way to the Happy Trails ending. You'll find it on YouTube, and I'm still Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails.